The topic is externality market failure. In addition to public good market failure, externality market failure is the second market failure idea we will use in this course. What is an externality? One common definition is costs or benefits of market transactions not reflected in prices. This is a pretty good definition, but I have another definition that I prefer. An externality is an unintentional, non-market interdependence. We want a definition that works, and by works, I mean we can correctly identify the circumstances that will mean the perfectly competitive market allocation will not maximize net social benefit. If all three elements of my definition are present, then you can safely conclude there is an externality market failure. I'll tell you right now, many people assert externalities exist in circumstances that are not actually associated with an inefficient market allocation. I say when this happens, the concept of externality is being misused or abused. Please, just say no to externality abuse. Let's move on now to a discussion of these three elements in my favorite definition. Notice that a market is made up of pairwise voluntary social interactions. The social interaction is, of course, a form of interdependence. In this case, it is an intentional interdependence. Both the buyer and the seller are attempting to reach an agreement. The buyer and the seller are intentionally trying to cooperate. With an externality, there is an unintended interdependence. There is a third party, or another person besides the buyer and the seller, who is better off or worse off because of the market transaction between buyer and seller. Further, it is the case that neither the buyer nor the seller intend, with their interaction, to help or harm the third party. The help or harm to the third party cannot be because of the workings of the market allocation process. The unintended interaction that brings the third party into our conceptual picture must be non-market. It must be outside the market, so to speak. Perhaps we can say that this part of the definition shows us where the external idea comes from in the word externality. Let's talk about the go-to illustration of an externality. Pollution often fits the definition of an externality. Take the example of air pollution from a coal-fired electricity power plant. The owner of this electricity generation business burns coal in the process of producing electricity. The electricity is then sold to consumers. In the production process, coal is burned, but there are byproducts of this production that the business can't figure out how to capture and sell to others. These byproducts are materials and gases. The business looks for the least cost alternative to dispose of these byproducts, and let's assume the least cost alternative is releasing these byproducts as smoke out a chimney. The released smoke becomes crap in the air, which makes at least some people worse off. These people may dislike breathing the dirty air, or they may dislike looking at the dirty air, or perhaps dirty air obscures a beautiful view they enjoy looking at. The crap in the air is air pollution. Are the elements of an externality present in these circumstances? Yes, they are. Let's see how. The people who are worse off because of the air pollution are third parties. There is therefore an interaction between the buyers and the seller of electricity and those other people we call third parties. This interaction with third parties is unintended. The purpose of the market interaction between a buyer and a seller of electricity is not to harm these others. The consumer intends to personally be better off with electricity. The seller intends to be personally better off with the profit enjoyed by the exchange. I think we can even say that neither the buyer nor the seller in their interaction can identify a person we identify as a third party. This interdependence with a third party is also outside the market. The interdependence works through the air or through the environment. It certainly is not a market interaction. We thus have all the elements. We have an unintended, non-market interdependence associated with air pollution that is the consequence of the market allocation of resources to the production and consumption of electricity. Let's also at this stage of our discussion point out that if there is harm to third parties, we say the externality is a negative externality. If there is benefit to third parties, we say we have a positive externality. This illustration of air pollution is an illustration of a negative externality. It may seem odd, but perhaps air pollution could be a positive externality as well. You see, I grew up in Southern California, in a place with much air pollution at that time. Because of the air pollution, there were many wonderfully colorful skies at sunset. So, for me, I may have been better off with air pollution at sunset than without. If so, we would then have the elements of a positive externality. Let's talk about a few illustrations that I don't think are externalities. I got my PhD at the University of Wyoming. When I moved there in 1975, Laramie was quite a small town. There was no McDonald's. I got my fast food hamburgers at a local mom and pop burger joint. A couple of years after moving to Laramie, McDonald's moved just down the street for mom and pop. I switched to McDonald's, and apparently many other people did as well because mom and pop went out of business less than a year later. Is this a negative externality? Mom and pop were worse off because McDonald's moved to town. But this is not an externality because the interaction between McDonald's and its customers caused an impact on mom and pop which takes place through the market allocation process. Third-party market interactions are not externalities. This is actually an illustration of how the market process works well. Suppose I notice a TV I want through my neighbor's living room window. And suppose I work out a way to get into that house and take my neighbor's TV. Is this an externality? I say no. For one thing, there is no third party. The social interaction is between me and my neighbor. It is not a voluntary interaction. Perhaps we can say it is very much like a pairwise exchange, but it happens to take place at my preferred terms of trade. No price to me. Violations of property rights are crimes, not externalities. Actually, you can expect that most real negative externalities emerge in circumstances where people do not recognize well-defined property rights. But violating the property rights of others is not an efficiency issue. It is not a matter of allocating resources efficiently to different production and consumption activities. It is a matter of crime, not efficiency. However, there are economists who will tell you that crime is a negative externality. So, I guess you need to assess my reasons for saying no externality here versus the reasons of those who say externality. Now, let's talk about Bob. Bob is another professor. He and I had a disagreement recently during a faculty meeting. During the meeting, there was a thunderstorm. After the meeting, I'm unhappy. I noticed Bob walking in the parking lot, and I noticed lots of puddles from the rain. So, I decide to drive through a puddle and splash water all over Bob. Externality? Nope. Bad behavior on my part. This is not an issue that involves the efficient allocation of resources. Intentional harm done to another is not an externality. It is not even an efficiency issue. Oh, and as I was driving home, there was standing water on the interstate. I was driving too fast when I hit some of the standing water. I lost traction and spun off the side of the interstate. I crashed into a fence post and bumped my head. Not an externality. It's just me involved. This is an accident and not a matter concerning the efficient allocation of resources. You might ask, what about the owner of the fence post? Say my car destroyed the fence post. Externality? I say no. Property rights are well defined. Further, there are just two parties. There is no market exchange involved, and an externality is supposed to be a source of market failure. Once again, I must admit, there are economists who will tell you accidents are negative externalities. I've just told you why I say, not so. You'll have to draw your own conclusion, especially if you don't find my reasons convincing. So, this ends part 1 of the lesson on externality market failure. Part 2 will discuss what we can learn from graphical models of externalities.